Welcome to the Ghost Love Quilt Block tutorial. This is a foundation paper piecing pattern. When you get your pattern, copy it on cheap copy paper. Cut out each unit. Using your reference guide, label each section in each unit. This does two things. When you rough cut your fabric, it will make sure that you're cutting out the right fabric for the right section. And when you bring it to the sewing machine, you can make sure that your fabric is in the right order before you sew. Here we're going to rough cut our fabric pieces. Notice that I put the paper pattern right on the fabric and estimate generously larger than each section. I like to do the same color of fabric for all sections before I move on, and you'll notice that I do the larger sections and work down to my smaller sections. This process can seem tedious, but this is the most important part. If you can prepare your patterns, then as you go to sew, everything just seems to run smoothly and quickly. Some of these units have a lot of sections. I find it helpful to put your fabric pieces in order as you go along. We'll start off with Unit P. We're going to grab our cardstock and fold on each line. Grab your fabric pieces, make sure they're in order. Line your fold up 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric and sew. Remember, on your pattern you have 2 black dots on this one. You want to back stitch and make sure that you get it nice and secure so that when we pull off our paper pattern, we keep that seam nice and taut. Now that we've completed Unit P, we're going to trim around the edges. Line your ruler up on the 1/4 inch seam allowance line and trim. Unit N. First thing is to grab our cardstock and fold on every line. You'll notice that I put the first fabric section the wrong way. You want to start with section 1 fabric with the back side of the fabric facing the back side of the paper pattern. I'm just going to flip it around, make sure that it still covers that section 1 paper pattern area, and then trim that 1/4 inch seam allowance from the fold. Line up section 2 fabric, take it to the machine, and sew. Remember to backstitch everywhere you see a black dot. That will reinforce our seam when we pull off the paper at the end. Now that our unit is complete, we'll trim the edges. On your pattern, there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance line. Line your ruler up with that and trim. This is one of my favorite units in this pattern because you can make this detailed and make it look exact. Unit S, the first thing we'll do is grab our cardstock and fold on every line. Section 1 starts in the middle, so when I grab my long white fabric piece, I'm going to line it up and hold it with my hands as I line up section 2 fabric piece, and then I'm going to take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch on every black dot so that we have a nice strong seam. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Make sure that as you line up your fabric, it's nice and flat. You can see that I'm using my fingers to lengthen that out. Grab my next fabric piece, line it up, and take it to the machine. Here I'm just making sure that I've got everything in the right order. Now that our unit is complete, we will trim off the edges. We'll line up our ruler with that 1/4 inch seam allowance line on the paper pattern. Unit C, this is one of our smaller units. We'll take our cardstock and fold on each line. With smaller units, for me, I find it easier just to hold it in my hand instead of set it down and line everything up. I just line up my fabric pieces and hold the pattern and then take it to the machine. Remember to do your back stitch whenever you see a black circle so that we can reinforce that seam when we pull off the paper pattern at the end. Now that our unit is complete, I'll turn it over and trim around that 1/4 inch seam allowance line that's indicated on our paper pattern. Unit G, The first thing that we'll do is grab our cardstock and fold on each line all the way across our paper pattern. Our section 1 starts in the middle, so I'll grab my fabric piece in my hand and just hold it as I trim with my scissors a 1/4 inch seam allowance from that fold. Then I'll grab my second section fabric, line it up, and take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch when you come across a black dot. This will keep our seam nice and strong when we pull off our paper pattern at the end. Now that our unit is complete, we'll turn it over, line our ruler up with the 1/4 inch seam allowance line, and trim all the way around. Unit M. The first thing we'll do is grab our cardstock and fold on each line all the way across the paper pattern. I'm going to take my section 1 fabric and my section 2 fabric, line them up, fold on the line between section 1 and 2, keep a 1/4 inch seam allowance with my fabric, and take it to the machine. Now that this unit is complete, we'll turn it over, line up our ruler with our 1/4 inch seam allowance line on our paper pattern, and trim all the way around. Okay, now on to Unit J. The first thing we'll do is use our cardstock and fold across each line. I have a larger piece. I'm going to use my scissors to trim. It doesn't look good, so I'm going to use my ruler and make a nice 1/4 of an inch trim. We've finished this unit, so we're going to turn it over, line our ruler up on that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance line on the paper pattern, and trim all 4 sides. Unit H. The first thing we'll do is use our cardstock and fold across the line. Make sure to backstitch whenever you see a black circle so that we can reinforce that seam when we pull the paper pattern off at the end. We've finished each unit. It's time to tear the paper off. I hold my thumb over the seam or next to it as I tear with my other hand. We've made it to the fun part. Now we're going to take our unit, line up our pieces, and carefully sew them together. One helpful tip that I want to share, I keep my left pointer finger to the left of the sewing foot. This helps to keep my seams straight and my fabric stable as I go over seams as I get to the corner of the unit, and also when I work with really small units. There has been a long debate among quilters whether pressing your seam open or leaving it closed is more effective. In this pattern tutorial, I do both. I have found that if you stitch between a length of 1 and 1.5, it will keep your quilt block strong for years to come. Working with smaller units can be a little tricky. Sometimes I like to line them up, press them, and then take them to the sewing machine. I use that left pointer finger on the left of my sewing foot to guide my fabric through to keep that seam straight and my fabric in line. This is one unit that I will press an open seam so the heart will lay down flat. For this next part, you want to line up those two seams. I will pin on both sides of the seam. Thanks for following along on the Ghost Love Quilt Block tutorial.